SEGA Saturn SHIRO.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the SHIRO Editor's Corner, a completely new and unscripted series of mini-casts with your hosts Dave and Peter. Come join your elder SHIROs as we reminisce on our favorite Saturn memories in this new and nostalgia-packed podcast series. Hey everyone, it's Saturn Dave, and I've got Peter here with me. How's your week been?
Not too bad. Actually finished the Shining Force 3 Premium disc. That was fun, and just I've been getting right back into Nights again because we're coming up on Christmas, so it's almost traditional that we have to do that. So that's what I've been up to. What about you, Dave? How's your week been?
You didn't have any time to play video games over the last couple years, right? So now all of a sudden it's like a flood coming back. You have all this time to game and stuff now. That's good. I'm glad for you. You inspired me actually to get back into Shining Force 3. Actually, all that talk about playing the translated scenarios, and so a couple years ago I had an issue with my backup RAM card, which we've talked about on the hardware episode, and that is the one save that I lost in that whole debacle.
Oh no!
And I'm sure the pain that goes with sinking so many hours into an epic RPG only to lose all of it, kind of knocks you off your horse, and it's hard to get back up on, it's hard. You're like, where do I begin? What do I do? I forgot what was going on in the story. I have to start from the beginning. I just, and it took some time, to just kind of get over it. And so, yeah, I was, you were saying you just finished all three scenarios, and now you've finished the special disc. And so I was like, yeah, I think it's about time. Not that I have a lot of time to sink into games these days, but yes. Yeah, I was just like, it's just such a phenomenal game for anybody who doesn't know or hasn't checked it out. Shining Force 3 is it's an aesthetic. It's it's a thing all its own. It's not like any other JRPG that I can think of, and that's a good thing,
It's so well done.
Yeah, kind of like Knights in the fact that when you're playing Knights, that's it. You're playing Knights. There's nothing else like it. Shining Force 3 definitely has clones. There are definitely other games that are kind of like it, but nothing has the same vibe. Nothing has the same art style or aesthetic that it does. The music is phenomenal. The dialogue, the intrigue, the betrayal.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very political game too, so it's not caught up on love stories or anything like that.
It's a very mature game, really. I mean, if you think about it, the themes are mature, and I think as I've gotten older, I've enjoyed it more, and like Knights, I find that it really plays to the Saturn's strength.
Yes.
I mean, this is not a game that I think I could see on any other platform of the time. This is a Saturn game,
Yeah.
So it's just great that way.
And it's a comfy game. And that's completely anecdotal term. But I mean, there are games that I get into for comfy gaming, where I would describe it as just you've got your drink of choice and you are in a nice comfy position and you could just bliss out to a certain game. PSO was one of those kind of games for me. You can get really, really into it. You can be super focused on it, or you can just be grinding, one of the battle maps and just kind of having fun. In the beginning valley where worms and other things are just spawning constantly, you can just grind for levels. It's a lot of fun. And I find the character animations to be charming, and it's crude, of course, graphically speaking, compared to what folks are used to. But I mean, it's definitely a charming little game for sure.
It's just too bad that so few people have enjoyed it. If only there was a modern way, maybe say a Saturn Mini. If only there was a Saturn Mini, this would be a perfect game to stick on there, don't you think, Dave?
Yeah. Well, yeah, sure. I do, but it's funny because that's a loaded topic since we didn't really get the whole game in the West, right?
How true.
Yeah, so you want to talk about that? I guess this episode we're going to talk about the Saturn Mini. because why not? It's
Yeah.
not that I wouldn't say we're running out of things to talk about, but this week with the holidays and everything kind of like ran up on us and caught me off guard at least. So I'm just like, Peter's like, let's talk about the Saturn Mini. I'm like, sure, I'm game. I've got things to say. So, I mean, where do we begin? Like, do you think that there will be a Saturn Mini?
I do not think there will be one in the immediate future. I would like to be proven wrong, but I don't. I don't see one happening for 5 years. Let's say. I think it'll be a while.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious. Like, I mean, so lots of companies have now put out minis. What do you think of minis in general? Like, what are your thoughts, like in general, of these micro consoles? You like them? You hate them? Do you think they're just kind of a gimmick? Do you get them, play them for 10 minutes, and then shelf them? Like, how where do your feelings lie about minis in general?
Well, right. So it really is subjective because the way I feel about minis having almost every console, like the real console with all the games and everything like that, is going to be different than how some casual gamer or person who's completely sworn off gaming for years, and just wants to dip their toe back in is going to feel about it. Right. So I would say that for someone like a hardcore retro gamer who is really into collecting hardware and stuff like that, they're more of a token piece, maybe like some shelf candy. It's nice to get these tiny little, consoles and put them on your shelf because I think that's, aside from playing with them a little bit, most people probably end up boxing them and putting them on the shelf, just to as part of their collection. But then you've got the folks who are very casual, not really into gaming. Maybe they don't have any consoles, or maybe the only console they have is like a Switch or something, or PlayStation 5 or something, and they want to get into the retro stuff. It's an easy, way to do it without having to go on OfferUp and get the console and go scrounging for the games or buying a lot on eBay or something like that. Just get something like that, enjoy it, show it to your kids or whatever, and then put it on OfferUp, which is what I see a lot of people doing, with like the original Genesis Mini. I see so many of those on OfferUp because people tried it out, they played with it for like a year or two, and then they're passing
It's
it
time
on
to
to
move on.
whoever, And I see it with the NES and the SNES. I don't see the TurboGrafx one, the PC
Mm-hmm.
Engine ones. I don't see those on resale. Like the people who got those got them to keep them, because again, it was so niche, right? So
Yes.
rare of a console to begin with. It's like you don't have a bunch of people, at least in the West here, getting those things for nostalgia sake. It's like if to hold on to it too.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but I mean, it's a subjective topic, and I guess to me, like I say, there's not that much value in them because I really just love real hardware. But would I
Yeah.
get a Saturn Mini? Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. To me, the two Genesis minis that have come out, I of course have them both, and to me they're like a fantastic little tribute
Mm-hmm.
console. Got the nostalgia for the system. So, a lot of the games on both minis I do own already and have owned for years. So, it's not like I'm getting a new game experience from that perspective. But there are also games on both of those that I have not owned physically. So that's kind of a nice sort of, it's got some utility to it. But I agree, to a casual fan, they're probably fantastic because it's a way to explore and experience, some of that particular console's best games in like a mini little cheap format. So from that perspective, I think they're kind of nice. But you're right. Like, I mean, if I think about myself now, so I've got a full US Saturn set. What could a Saturn Mini possibly offer me from a gameplay perspective that I don't have on my shelf right now, that I don't, play on a regular basis right now? So, you're right. It might be more of just eye candy on the shelf, or yet another piece to the Saturn collection that you sort of add. So yeah, for us hardcore Saturn fans, I'm not sure what the gaming utility is really going to be like in terms of a
I mean,
Saturn
to be
Mini.
fair, Saturn is very expensive to collect for, right? If you were a Saturn fan back in the day and you got rid of it and you've been just blissfully unaware for, a couple decades, and then now you're starting to get back into it, you might be going like, oh my God, like I cannot afford to mortgage my house so that I can get into Saturn again. Those people might want something like this. It might be a nice way to officially throw their money at Sega and whatnot, like, and buy the games legally and be able to enjoy them, maybe even show their kids or their grandkids at this point. But I mean, like, yeah, for you and me, the hardcore gamers who have like a lot, and we have ODEs and we have all this whatnot, I think it represents something that we would buy anyway, just because we love the Saturn so much. It's like, I don't care what it has on it. It's a mini Saturn, technically a little emulation box, or, I would get it just because I love the Saturn so much, but I don't know that it would get much play. To be honest, it would just like be, something else that would go in my collection, for display purposes or whatnot. But I mean, then again, it's like, who would this thing be for in the West? That again, like, I don't think it would even come out in the West, to be honest with you. Do I think there will be a Saturn Mini? Very likely so in Japan. Very likely so. I mean, just like there was a Game Gear Micro, right? I mean, those things are like Christmas tree ornaments, right? And they were really overpriced too for what you get. But again, like, the nostalgia is there. In Japan, they had like all these different colored Game Gears. They had like the Coca-Cola Game Gear, and they had, a lot of different colors and a lot of different flavors of it. And I mean, even though it's like the Game Gear, and relatively speaking, it wasn't like that phenomenally successful over there, there's enough people over there that have nostalgia for it that you could get away with something like that, right? Well, I mean, the Saturn was Sega's most popular console in Japan. And there are obviously tons of people that have nostalgia for it. I mean, just look at the Isekai Oji-san, Uncle from Another World. It's just loaded with Saturn references, right? And I mean, I can only imagine they're banking on the fact that most people are going to get those references because they're familiar with Saturn, at least to some degree. So yeah, I think it's very possible that there will be a Saturn Mini in Japan. I just don't know if the US will actually bother importing it, because again, like, what is the market for that going to be, here in the West? I don't know.
And yet arguably the TurboGrafx 16 got a Mini here, right? And
yeah, this is true. So yeah, it definitely could. I think it might be like maybe it'll be one of those things where they have to kind of gauge interest ahead of time, to see like, okay, how many are we going to actually sell in the West? I mean, if they make it in Japan, it's not that hard, right? To make it in the West. They've already made it, right? So that's the good thing. It's like, if it happens in Japan, there's a very good chance that they'll just make a smaller amount, ship them over here and sell them. And then you really just have to change like the ROMs or whatever.
So one way that a Saturn Mini would potentially be a lot more appealing to me. So again, considering that I've got the full US library and a huge host of import games too, from a gameplay perspective, if we look at the Genesis Mini, and especially the second Genesis Mini, they included a bunch of previously unreleased games. So if something like that were to happen,
right,
or even previously untranslated games, then that would all of a sudden really, the appeal would shoot up for me. Definitely.
Exactly. And I mean, that was one of the reasons why a lot of folks wanted the SNES Mini, because they had Star Fox 2, and it was not like folks couldn't play Star Fox 2 on an emulator before, but I mean, now you could literally officially buy Star Fox 2, like finally it got released in an official form, and it was on the box, plastered on the front of the box, now includes Star Fox 2, so I mean, that was a big deal for a lot of folks. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you. If they could put some unreleased games, but that's the thing, is some of those unreleased games were kind of niche though too. Like take Deep Fear, for example, which had a US version technically, but was never released in the West. Like, would they really put that on a Saturn Mini in the West? I don't know. Like, because how many people know about it, right? Like, I mean, we take it for granted, obviously, but it's still relatively unknown to a lot of folks who are just kind of like got out in 96 or 97, didn't stick around to the end and haven't really been in it. So, I always wonder about that kind of stuff. Like, to me, I would love to have it. I would love to have Deep Fear officially released in the West on a mini console, but would it happen? I don't know. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, from a license standpoint, Sega did it. So, they have the license. It'd be very easy. versus something like Capcom having to get something, so I don't know, it is first party, so
Yeah, and see, I think about what you just said, and I think in order to be successful in the West, a Saturn Mini would have to have a blend of, the hottest games that had come out. I'm talking about games like Knights, Panzer Dragoon, whatever. But you would also think that you would have to have some games from like that desert, that 1 year desert that we all had to endure as Sega gamers, from sort of the end of '98, when the Saturn was discontinued in the West, to the launch of the Dreamcast. I mean, that was a period of time where there was some really good Japanese games coming out on the Saturn in Japan, but there was nothing out here in the West. So, if you throw in some of the bigger titles that came out over there during that time period, then you might really be able to entice some more of the hardcore folks out. But there's another thing that you just mentioned that I think would actually cause some problems with bringing some of the bigger Saturn titles over, and that's licensing. As iconic as Daytona USA is on the Saturn, I just can't see that being included on a Saturn Mini, to my chagrin, really, because the license to use the Daytona name again would be prohibitively expensive. And unfortunately, in my opinion, that would actually touch on quite a number of Saturn titles that have some sort of licensing tie-in. And I mean,
right.
we're talking about essentially all of the racing
Hmm.
games are out the window right
Right,
there.
because Sega
You
Rally
know?
used like Toyota and Lancia,
Oh,
and
definitely.
Manx TT, it had like the Isle of Man, which was like
Yep.
an actual race, so yeah, there's a lot of licenses involved. You're right, so it's like, something like Knights would obviously be on there, they completely own that outright. um you know Sonic Jam, but I mean, like, that's the thing, is it's tough. Like, I feel like when a lot of people put together these lists, they're really not grounded in reality. They're just pie in the sky. Like, I would just love the Saturn Mini to have like yada yada yada, all these great games, but it's like we live in an age where there are non-disclosure agreements for everything, and where there are licenses and rights management and everything like that. It's just not realistic. They could release it, but they would have to just kind of make everything generic. But even like the Toyota Celica, like, it looks like a Celica, and so unless they change the model, I'm not sure if that would be something that Toyota would allow or something. I don't know. But that said, there are games like Panzer Dragoon. There are games like Bug,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
a Stall, I don't know. Can you think of others that you would want on there that wouldn't be caught up in some kind of litigation or licensing acquisition?
Well, geez, I mean, so you named off some of the big ones. Obviously, Knights. I would put a stall on there. Maybe the Clockwork Knight games.
Definitely. I don't care what people
Right
say. Like,
there.
I absolutely love Clockwork Knight.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, there's even games that came out later in the Saturn's life. Like we talked about Shining Force 3. That would be a nice one to put on there. What about Burning
Hmm.
Rangers? Like there's another good one that,
Yeah.
that could go on there that I don't think would have any licensing issues.
Oh yeah, definitely. But and we're all over the place here. I realize, because there's no script or outline for that matter. But I mean, I'm just wondering, like, could this thing even exist? Like, what would be under the hood? Would this just be pure emulation? Which I think these things tend to be, right? They're just
I think
emulator
so, yeah.
boxes, right? There's no
Yeah.
FPGA. That would make it prohibitively expensive. But if it was just an emulation box, which I think can be done now, based on what we've seen, you can emulate the Saturn on a potato. Honestly, folks, like, if folks still think that the Saturn is hard to emulate, then they just don't know how to do a proper Google search, because it's been doable for years. And I mean, anything from SSF, which runs on old XP machines, all the way up to Yabaos or Mednafen.
Yeah.
Beetle is another one. So there are a lot of different emulation options, and I'm sure Sega could cobble something together, or reach out and get something licensed. I mean, they have the S Tributes on the Switch. The Switch isn't like a
Yeah.
super powerful console. It's not, the hardware is not that beefy, and yet it's able to do Saturn emulation. So from a technical standpoint, they could do it, and I think that it could be affordable, because that's the thing. It has to have enough power to be able to do it, but it also has to be affordable. and it has to be within a time frame where, you know, people still care. You know, that's the other thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because it's like,
Yeah.
what if we wait long enough for it to be doable at a cheap enough price, but then nobody cares because the time has come and gone, you know,
Yeah.
for the general public, that is.
Well, I'm just wondering. So you're right. Like I just kept thinking as we were talking. I'm thinking, what would make this thing really appealing? Like, what could a Saturn Mini do that maybe other minis haven't done? You know, to really kind of stand out. And I was thinking, oh, you know, it'd be really cool if Netlink functionality was somehow preserved or restored, or there was some sort of, you know, to really bring some of those games back to life. But again, it then just comes back to cost. Like, you know, you add features, you add you know, different pieces of hardware or whatever, and your cost goes up. You know, the Genesis Mini 2 came out at $99 US, and I'm not sure that if you go too much higher than that, you would have much of a market anymore. You know, and when we all remember the Saturn 299 price point thing that happened at E3
Right.
95, you know, like it would be almost a similar situation where you're putting out a potentially good product, but you're just pricing it a little bit too high for folks to eat it up. So
Right.
there's lots of considerations there.
There would definitely be no chance of any kind of online functionality. And I say that because it's not even the networking gear that you have to put into it, whether it be Wi-Fi or LAN. It's the cost of maintaining servers. Because if you put it in there, you have to support it for, you know, there's an expectation that you're going to support it for at least a couple years, right? And they don't want to pay
Yeah.
it. They're not a company that's in a position to do that right now. You know, I mean, that was the thing with Sony. Like Sony, they were supporting PS2 online well into the late years of the PS3. You know,
Yeah.
and it was crazy. Like there were still kids, mostly younger kids who didn't have a PS3 yet. You know, who were still getting on with Ratchet and Clank. You know, death matches and stuff like that. And Sony did not want to have to support those games, like, but it was a reputation thing, you know, it was like an upholding the customer loyalty. And, you know, it's like, that was part of their thing. You know, they introduced some kind of online support. It was going to be around for a while, you know, for as long as the console was still relevant, and PS2 was relevant long into its life, you know? So yeah, that's the thing is I highly doubt that there will be any kind of online functionality. They just want to be like a one and done kind of box it up, ship it, and make money off of it, you know?
Okay, so if it was a one and done type of console, I guess the other question is, what controller do you include in that kind of a bundle, you know?
Definitely the quote unquote Model 2, I would think, controller, right? You know, the Japanese pad.
So then would you be happy to play Knights with that pad?
Certainly not, but I mean, it's like this whole device is a compromise. You know, like it is
Fair, yeah.
it is that's the thing, is it's not real. It's not a real Saturn. So right there is a compromise. Everything about it is going to be a compromise, but it's a list of pros and cons. You know, you get all these games in a cheap package. Who's it for? You know, I mean, who's the market? Is it going to attract people who never were into Saturn and are curious, or is it literally just a nostalgia trip for the small group of people in the West who got into it? You know, who know. And I mean, I say small, but it's significant enough that they can make some money off of it, provided that the fabrication costs aren't too high. You know, because they have to
Right.
offset that. You're right. They're going to go for the cheap, obvious titles that they don't have to pay any kind of license for because they already own it outright. You know, I mean, Sammy is the one calling the shots, right? And they're a holdings company, right? So all they care about is money. All they care about is the bottom line.
I was just thinking along that line, like some of the really great games, like even if you're thinking of games like Dragon Force, that's a Sega game, but the English translation is owned by Working Designs.
Right.
And even though they don't really exist anymore, I think Vic Ireland owns all of those, like all the rights to all that kind of stuff. I mean, the Genesis Mini 2 in Japan came out with the Lunar games.
Right.
And people were super excited that, okay, potentially we're going to get the Lunar games on the American version of that console.
Right.
And that didn't pan out.
Happen. Yeah.
And, you know, just they couldn't come to an agreement with Vic about, you know, payment and all the rest of it. So, you know, you take a game like Dragon Force, which is one of the system's most celebrated games in the West, and and it doesn't get on there.
Right.
You know, like
Exactly.
it's,
Like,
that's tough.
would it get on the Japanese version? Probably,
It might, yeah.
first party game, it's in Japanese, we're not talking localization or anything like that. So yeah, I mean, it's another one of those things where, like I said, it's an obvious shoe in for a Japanese release, the Saturn Mini. So much nostalgia. I mean, if they release any mini console in Japan, that's the one that makes the most sense. They're going to make the most money off of it. There was the largest install base, so they'll have easy decisions to make over there, because a lot of the stuff, they can avoid licenses, and they can also avoid dealing with localizations and stuff like that. But when it comes to possibly putting one out in the West, it's just really going to be compromised quite a bit, I think.
Yeah.
Because of that kind of stuff. Like, so I've seen a lot of videos. I've seen a lot of group topics and videos about this, and it's always kind of, what would you want to be on a Saturn Mini, and I mean, I hate to be all doom and gloom. It's funny because we're Saturn fans, we're huge Saturn fans. So if anything, you'd think that we would be the folks who would just be blind fanboys, every single great game, but it's I'm too old and too realistic to know that that's not going to happen. You could definitely have quite a few of the blockbuster titles that folks remember. But again, a Saturn Mini without Daytona is kind of a sad situation. I mean, sure, you'd have Virtua Fighter 2 on there. You could have the Virtua Cop games on there, though I don't know.
And
what
how
the
would
input...
you like guns in that case?
Yeah, exactly. It would be,
it's
it's a good question. I mean, at the minimum, Virtua Cop and Virtua Cop 2 play very well with a controller. They're still fun experiences, but it's a shadow of what it is with the light gun.
Of course,
it's just a totally different thing. So yeah, I don't know. I don't want this topic to be such a downer. But I feel like folks need to be realistic about this stuff.
Agreed.
Folks, if you're listening with us and you have opinions about this, please share your opinions. Let us know what you think. But the truth is, it's better to temper your expectations than have high hopes and just have them dashed, which we're used to now as Sega fans, I think, But I mean, hey, on the bright side, I heard Sonic Frontiers is good. And I haven't played it yet, but I am planning on getting it. And I'm glad to hear that there's an example of things going a little better, than what we're used to, they released a good, even decent, I'll take it, Sonic game in a long time, so, but yeah, in terms of the Saturn Mini, how about we do this? How about we just talk about some of the games that we would want to be on there, and then we'll just look at them, game by game, and kind of discuss how realistic it would be for them to be on there. What's one game that you would just have to have on a Saturn Mini, personally?
Well, so you know what, Dave? I'm just going to say the entire Panzer Dragoon trilogy.
And I agree. I agree that is... they would basically be tripping up if they didn't put Saga on there, because...
Yes.
People would finally get to play that game that they sunk so much time into, that they had one of their members die, during development. I mean, seriously, when you think about the blood, sweat, and tears that went into making that game, it has to be on this thing, so that people can experience it for a reasonable price, Definitely one of the strongest contenders on the Saturn, for sure, that entire series. So that, I think you're absolutely right, that would have to be a must. The Sonic Team games would have to be a must. You're right. I think Shining Force 3, if they could reach out maybe to the translators, the community translators like Night of Dragon, if they reach out to them, I don't know if they're humble enough, but I mean, Sega has worked with folks in the past. If they would be willing to put the 3 scenarios on it, that would be really cool. I mean, it's a phenomenal game. Having 2 trilogy series, the Panzer series and the Shining Force 3 trilogy on there would make it a heavy hitter, for sure. Just those 2 things on there. Like I said, I would buy it anyway, but I could highly recommend it to anybody. Go get this thing so that you can play these in a neat package with possibly save states, and just an easy, convenient way to just plug it into your, LCD or OLED TV and just play these, in your living room. I would definitely recommend it.
I'm just sort of thinking of some games that were Japanese exclusive titles that would actually make sense to release in the West. Games that weren't necessarily super heavy in language and wouldn't really feel too much out of context. Like I'm thinking of games like Steam Gear Mash. That would work out.
Oh yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
simple pick up and play type of game. It's colorful. It really kind of plays to some of the Saturn's strengths. So that
Right,
I could
right.
see working, on the Saturn Mini.
For sure. And that seems like one to me that would probably make it on a Japanese version.
Hmm.
So yeah, I wonder about those kind of games where it's like obviously a game that probably a lot of folks experienced over in Japan, and yet maybe nobody knows about it in the West, but if it's easy enough to toss on there, do they include it, because it's English friendly or easy to play in English? I don't know. Those are the ones where it's more of a guess for me. It's not as obvious of a thing. I mean, I think Steam Gear Mash is a great game, but it's not a system seller by any means. And I don't know, if it would end up on a Saturn Mini or not. But I definitely think that they've got the Puyo games, right? They've still got the rights to that. So you probably have a few Puyo games. Maybe you'd have, Puyo 2 and Puyo Sun without online capability, of course. You would probably have Baku Baku Animal, maybe.
Hmm. That's a good
That's a
one.
title they own. I've got to start looking at my shelf to kind of see what stuff they might have. I don't know if they would put Sonic 3D Blast on there.
Do you know? I wonder if the two, like a Decathlete and Winter Heat,
Oh, yes.
those would be
Decathlete and
nice.
Winter Heat.
Yeah.
Excellent titles, button mashing arcade games, but excellent titles nonetheless. Yeah, I could definitely see that on there. I could definitely see, to have Virtua Fighter 2 at least, if not both. I know the first one's kind of janky, so I just don't know how much of a mass market appeal there would be for that one,
Yeah.
even though I love it.
Yeah.
I know I love it in its janky, flat shaded poly glory. But yeah, I'm thinking Shining the Holy Ark, maybe.
Yeah,
I
that'd be a
mean,
great one to stick on there for sure.
it would be a great one to stick on there.
And to be honest, like Capcom has usually been pretty good about licensing their games onto the various mini consoles. So,
Yeah,
tons from their back catalog that would make sense to stick on a Saturn Mini.
that's true. Yeah, I mean they've always had a great relationship, and that's never really soured. So that's possible. I know Pat would want Mr. Bones on there.
Oh yeah, must buy
So
for him.
it would be a must buy. Yeah, I don't know. I think that he wouldn't get it if it didn't have Mr. Bones. Sonic R, I wonder. Like I think that folks have a lot of nostalgia for it, despite it being such a
Polarizing game, right?
polarizing. Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people are frustrated with the controls. I argue they don't really get it.
Yeah.
It's if you get it, then you're gonna have a lot more fun with it. But it's definitely not one of those games where you just pick it up and it starts working to your advantage. You really have to figure out how to play that game. Folks who approach it as a traditional racer just end up mashing the controller.
Yeah. And then there's games like, Die Hard Arcade. That would be a fabulous addition.
I was going to ask you about that one. So what do you think? Do you think that it would be a licensing issue with
So
the Fox Interactive, right?
the Japanese version didn't have the Die Hard license.
Right.
So is there a way to somehow put the Die Hard Arcade game without the Die Hard Arcade license? Like would that,
Yes. They would have to. I would think they would have to do that.
Yeah, cost-wise you would think, right?
If they would just release it as Dynamite Deca in the West and just count on folks to know that it was the same thing, or do they just not even put it? Again, all hypothetical. If the Saturn Mini comes out in Japan, which, like I said, I think it's very likely that it will, Dynamite Deca is a shoe-in, title for the console, and there's no reason why they wouldn't put it on there that I can think of. So really, it just comes down to, would it make it onto a Western version, if a Western version even comes out, I mean, again, I think it's more likely that they put out a Western Dreamcast Mini than a Saturn Mini, believe it or not, because the Dreamcast, I think, had a better attach rate here in the West.
Yes.
Like, I mean, so I wouldn't call the Dreamcast a failure. Like it did fine. It was just, it was like it was the third rung, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And had they been able to keep it going, still, it just would have been a third rung, But of course, once the, Xbox came out and it was like 4 players, the market just couldn't sustain 4 players,
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, still there's enough folks that have fond memories of the Dreamcast that it seems logical to me that you'd have a Dreamcast Mini over here. There would be enough folks that would be into that,
Mm-hmm.
but the Saturn one is really tough sell when you look at just how it did over here commercially.
Yeah, and so it's, I don't want to say it, but it's starting to sound like us two hardcore Saturn fans are almost advocating against there being a Saturn Mini launched here.
No, I wouldn't go so far. I'm saying that I remain incredibly skeptical that it'll happen. Like if they announce a Japanese version and they don't announce a US version, like for any kind of significant amount of time, I'm just going to pre-order the Japanese version.
Of course.
You know what I mean?
Of course.
Because I'm not going to wait and see if, you know what I'm saying? Unless it's obvious and they say, yeah, we're going to release it in the West too,
Mm-hmm.
And they were pretty forthcoming about that with the Genesis 2 Mini, like you knew that there was going to be a Genesis 2 Mini along with the Mega Drive 2 Mini, right? So if it's that obvious that there's going to be one, and then I even might still get the Japanese one because it might be white, not to mention the fact that it may have games that, like we've mentioned, won't make it over to the US version. But I'm still looking at my shelf and just trying to see if I'm missing anything. Like, I don't know, Legend of Oasis. That strikes me as one that's
a good one.
It's first party. It's I don't think there are any issues bringing that over. It is 2D. I mean, which the Saturn was great at. So again, like if folks, I don't know how many folks played it or would have nostalgia for it, but it was a great game. And I definitely, it's like a kind of like a Zelda derivative. Really good game though.
Great
folks
game.
Should definitely check it out. So yeah, that one and a stall strike me as like obvious 2D games that would be, like no brainer to put on there. Bug and Bug 2, Clockwork Knight 1 and 2.
What about a game like Power Slave?
Absolutely. Definitely. Power Slave, Quake and Duke Nukem, those are much more mainstream, and I don't know what the licensing issues would be with those, but definitely Power Slave is one. But, it came out on PlayStation as well. Yeah, I don't know with Power Slave. Would I want it to be on there? Yes, absolutely. But I just don't know if it's likely to be one that would end up on there. What do you think about sports games? Like, are there any sports games that you would say held up enough that they would? Okay, you mentioned Decathlete and Winter Heat. Those are obvious choices. There's no like rosters with like actual names on them. So maybe you couldn't have like a basketball game or a baseball game. You couldn't have World Series Baseball 2, right? Because there were actual names in there.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good point.
Yeah, and that would actually knock out the vast majority of the sports games, really.
Right. Right.
That's unfortunate.
I mean, and that's a shame too, because some of those games are phenomenal. I mean, some folks are not going to care about this at all. Some folks don't care about sports games, but I mean, Saturn was actually had a lot of really great sports games, you know?
I mean, even a title like Virtua Racing, that one I actually don't see any licensing issues with.
Right.
So, I mean, that could be one that comes out.
What about Albert Odyssey?
Again, though, Working Design owns the translation, right?
Oh, right. Yeah, no, you're right.
So, agreed. Like, that would be a fun one to have on there. And I'm even thinking, for example, like, okay, the first Tomb Raider. So whoever owns that IP now, if they're amenable to, to licensing the game out sort of the way Capcom has, and if the price is right, then that might be a good one to have.
I just don't think that it's synonymous enough with the Saturn in people's minds, to go on a Saturn Mini, like, we know that it started development on this for the Saturn, and it was like supposed to be a Saturn game and Sony stole it away. But I mean, most people by now, unfortunately, the winners write the history books, right? And, the victor, history is written by the victor, So, I mean, most people just think of Tomb Raider as being like a PlayStation property. So I just don't think it is an obvious choice to go on a Saturn Mini, which is like, here is a tribute to this console and everything great about it, sleeper hit, Dark Savior, I think would be a good one. And no licensing issues that I can think of. It was essentially Um, Dark Savior was that? It was
Mm,
almost like a spiritual successor to another game. I might.
Light Crusader, you're
Oh, Light
thinking.
Crusader, right? Okay.
Yeah, but that would be a good one. That's a title that didn't get the attention it deserved
Ooh,
while the Saturn was current.
Fighting Vipers and Fighters Mega Mix.
Yes.
Although Mega Mix has Pepsi Man in there.
Well, but not in the North American version, I don't think.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, like I mean, those two would be fun. Like, those Sega 3D fighters were really quite good, and they translated over well for the most part to the Saturn. So again, those would be solid choices.
And I think KO2 Flying Squadron would be a great one to release both on a Japanese version and on a Western. So like PAL gamers got KO2 Flying Squadron, right?
Yeah.
And I love the game. It's not like the best platformer or the best shooter, but you put them together, it offers a lot.
Yep.
I would definitely call it like a B plus game. Cool. It's cool. I love the game. It's one that we didn't get in the US. It'd be a good one to put on the console if they could. It was JVC published it, I think. But
So would there be any games, Dave, that Sega could put on the Mini that only came out in Japan that didn't have too much of a language barrier? Like, I'm not talking about, RPGs or whatever, because the translation costs would be pretty phenomenal. But can you think of any titles? Like, I mean, there's a plethora of schmucks
right,
that could go on, right? I mean, I'm talking about the
right.
Cotton games, for example, that, minimal translation there, if any, and, a whole host of others, really.
Yeah, I'm looking in my folder. I'm looking in my network folder of like ROMs to see if there's I mean, well, definitely. Okay. Well, I certainly think that Saturn Bomberman, if they could get that on there,
Oh, yeah.
it would be a must. But of course, it wouldn't have online functionality. But it would have local multiplayer, right? I don't know. Maybe that's one that would be prohibitive because they would have no intention of releasing, a multi tap or I don't know how you would do that with USB or multiple controllers. How many controllers would the console support being linked via Bluetooth or whatnot? But yeah, so again, there are like little things to consider in terms of like what's realistic. Definitely Saturn Bomberman is a strong title and one that I think they would want to put on there. So to your question, well, the Puyo games, obviously, the
Hmm.
Puyo Puyo, those are an obvious choice. Um,
What about something like a Radiant Silvergun?
Radiant Silvergun, yeah, okay. It does have a translation. It was a treasure game. It did have a translation done for the 360. They're releasing it again now. They've released it again on the Switch, right?
Yeah.
Using that translation, I believe. So yeah, that seems like another one that they would probably put on there. And while I'm at it, maybe any of the Taito games, like maybe Galactic Attack.
Oh, it's such a good game.
I would love it if they put, the Vampire series, like the
Mm.
Vampire Hunter, Vampire Savior.
Yep.
Again, Capcom games, they would have to work with Capcom, but I could definitely see that being awesome. Darius Gaiden,
Oh, yeah.
perhaps.
What about like Haunted Casino? I'm kidding.
Okay.
That
Now you're
would
just being silly.
definitely not
Uh,
make it on.
no, definitely not. Talk about like let's take the most obscure game that we possibly can. I mean, now I could see that's another thing too. There are some really great games, like for example, Densha de Go.
Yeah.
Great little game, but again, you have to have that train controller, otherwise it doesn't really make much sense. Like I've played the game on a regular pad, and it's not the same. It's all about that train controller, right?
Yep.
So while there's a game that I think a lot of Japanese gamers would have fond memories for, I just don't know if that would hit a mini console due to, or any other game that relied on a bespoke peripheral.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. Like we mentioned the Virtual Cop games. Would they make it? I don't know, because are they going to release it with a gun? Probably not. Extra money and all that. I just don't know. So anything that required an add-on peripheral, probably not. Which is another thing with Saturn Bomberman. They had like that multi-tap that would come with it, the S-bomb tap or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering like if that would make it. But So Deep Fear, mention that again. That I think that would be an obvious one. First party game.
Maybe Dead or Alive. That's a good one.
Dead or Alive. Yeah, it was multi-platform.
Yeah,
But
that's
yeah,
true.
I could see that. I could see that. It's not one of the ones that just like hits me as like it must be on there, but definitely it's a good one. And again, if they are running into a lot of issues with licensing and stuff, they might have to just fill it out with what they can get versus what they would ideally want.
Yeah, oh, definitely. And again, even just looking at Capcom, because they seem to have been the most friendly third-party publisher to send their titles to the various minis.
Right.
I mean, there's for all the games that we got here in the West from Capcom, there was, multiples more in Japan. So even things like Dungeons and Dragons, that potentially, but again, then we're getting into licensing. So
right,
it's such a shame, isn't it? Because we're running against either licensing issues in some cases, or the requirement for extra hardware in other cases, or online functionality. And I really like all of those are flags for me, red flags that
right.
it just wouldn't really quite work. So I mean, I don't know. Like, I'll tell you what, like doing my best of Saturn posts and doing all the research and all the Japanese games, that console during its lifespan was incredibly well targeted to the Japanese culture. It really clicked and it made sense. I'm thinking even of all those like, dating sims and visual novels and whatever. A lot of them were based on some current anime at the time or some other property or whatever. So like, it was definitely a console that you had to sort of dive in and experience at the time. And the more we talk through having a mini, I'm just not sure how much of that spirit it would be able to capture effectively.
Right.
Like you could certainly do bits and pieces of it, of course, but I'm not sure that, it would be able to encapsulate the Saturn experience as well as the Genesis Mini did, or the Super NES Mini did for
Right.
Nintendo's console, and so on and so forth, right? And the last thing I would want to happen is to see Sega put out a Saturn Mini, to the same quality as the PlayStation Mini.
Right.
Which was garbage, right? So,
until folks got a hold of it and just crammed whatever they wanted on there, right?
Of course,
like
of
that's
course,
basically
yes,
what it's.
right.
It'll go down as like just another kind of like Raspberry Pi situation, where it's like put whatever you want on there. But yeah, no, you're right. When it comes to like a curation of games that pays tribute to the console, I was thinking of stuff like Grandia, right?
Mm-hmm.
It seems like a great choice, and there's no issue. I think. Well, actually, Working Designs did the No, wait, Sony did the translation on the PlayStation.
I think Sony did the translation.
Yeah, so I don't know if that would end up on there, but again, my mind just immediately goes towards the fact that these mini consoles, they seem to usually focus on like pick up and play gaming experiences,
mm-hmm.
Rather than long RPGs. I guess there have been some, RPGs on these things, but they tend to go with the more like casual gaming experiences. An RPG is definitely not that. It's, something you really need to sink time into, And so, I mean, again, the target market for these things are going to be adults, obviously, who are, revisiting a nostalgia trip, and how much time do they have to sink into RPGs? So I don't know. Would I love it to have Grandia? Absolutely. Now, I think that Sakura Wars is obvious for a Japanese version of the console. I mean, it's just it cannot be understated how phenomenally popular that was over in Japan, and I think like, at least Sakura Wars 1, maybe both Sakura Wars 1 and 2 might come out on a Japanese version of the console.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Definitely Guardian Heroes. We forgot to mention Guardian Heroes, another treasure game. So maybe the 1-2 punch of Guardian Heroes and Radiant Silvergun, those two games coming out on it, I think from Treasure, makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It kind of makes you think that it would be a lot tougher to curate a representative Saturn library of games than it was necessarily for the Genesis, or even that it could be for a future Dreamcast Mini.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like it's tougher to do for the Saturn.
It really is. Last Bronx I would put on there, but I don't know how many people would. That would make a Japanese one. It was huge in Japan. Last Bronx.
Yes.
Anime comics or manga. They had a movie, full live action movie. So, you know what I'm thinking too? It's not been an issue as much with the, so it hasn't been an issue as much with the 16-bit games because they weren't able to really do as much license marketing, you know, cross
Yeah.
promotion back then. You know, that really was a thing that hit in the mid 90s. And you had Sega in the arcade putting like Coca-Cola banners in Top Skater. That's why
Yes.
we haven't seen Top Skater come out in any other form, because there's so much marketing in that, you know, or at least there's definitely Coca-Cola. And I mean, that's, you know, one of the biggest brands in the world. I mean, there's no
Oh
way
yeah.
you're paying, there's no way you're getting that, you know, for like a cheap little, you know, here, we're going to re-release this game. Coca-Cola's like, okay, pay up, you know, and it's this huge banner. What else are you going to put on there? You know, what are you going to put? Fizzy Cola or something? That's what they would have to do. They would have to go edit the assets and just take any, you know, form of Coke out of there, you know.
But really, that does take away from some of the charm, doesn't it?
I mean,
Uh,
it
like
wouldn't,
the
for, I would
nostalgia,
still
anyway.
play it, but yeah, for nostalgia purposes, is like, I know what was there, you know. If
Yeah.
they could do some, and that's the other thing too, they might hire an artist to create some kind of texture that it looks like it, and then they could still get sued by Coke because they say that looks too much like our logo, and you know
Yeah.
that's our logo, you know. So it's like they would have to change it completely to
Yeah.
be out of the woods, you know. I mean, because it's one thing if it's some really, you know, obscure reference or something like that, but when it's Coke, forget it. Like, they're gonna sue your pants off if you even put anything in there that slightly resembles their brand, you know. So
Yeah.
you know, that's the thing, that's the issue, is you had a lot of that. For example, Cool Spot on the 16-bit platforms, that's never,
Mm.
you know, that wouldn't make a mini release, right? Because of the Sprite branding, you know, and the
Yep.
license for that. So, but that was one game in like a sea of games that didn't have any of that kind of stuff, you know. That was relatively new thing back then in the 16-bit era. But when you reached the 32-bit era and the multimedia generation, then all of a sudden games were doing it, you know, starting to put advertising and licensing and branding and stuff like that in their games, you know, to, I don't know, subconsciously reach youths. I don't know. So yeah, that ends up being an issue. And then you know, it's sad to think about, but you're right about the localization aspect as well. Yeah, I don't know. There are a bunch of games here that I would love to have on it, like Lunacy. I love the game. I would love it to be on a mini console, but that's just me. Like, I just don't know how many people would care or be interested in that. Magical Drop, I could see that. I could see some Magical Drop being on there along with the Puyo games. You know, we've talked about the Capcom fighters, so, you know, like Marvel superheroes. Um,
Ninpen Manmaru, I wouldn't mind seeing, but that would be on the Japanese side, to be
that
honest.
would be on the Japanese side, and I don't even know, like, was it that, like, I like it, but it's not very polished.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
I don't
It's
know.
definitely proto 3D. Definitely.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Any SNK stuff? I wonder about any SNK stuff. So there was a lot of SNK
Yeah.
material on the Saturn,
Yeah.
you know, like
To
Metal Slug
varying
and stuff.
degrees of quality, but yes. Yeah.
Right, right. You know, so I don't know if they would even bother, but
Yeah. It's tough. Like the more we talk it through, again, you know, whatever Saturn Mini may materialize, it would be a very sort of limited, compromised representation of what us hardcore fans really remember and crave.
right.
If done right, I think it could appeal to casual fans. And one thing that I liked with Sega's two mini Genesis Mega Drive consoles is the user interface was really cool, and it really paid homage to, you know, the branding of the time and the colors and sounds and whatever. So, you know, imagine doing a Saturn Mini with, you know, some variation of that spaceship or whatever, and, you know, like it could be done really well,
Oh yeah.
to sort
You
of,
know,
you know, so that piece of it could be super cool. But you know, in terms of actual game selection, you take away the light guns, you take away the branding, you take away sports, you know, like player names and all the rest of it. And you take away the peripherals, the 3D pad, the multi tap for Bomberman and whatever, and your choices really dwindle fast. So
Right.
it would have to be a very, very well thought out piece of kit to pass mustard with us, but not impossible. I don't want to say it's impossible, nor do I want to say it will never happen, but
Well, I mean, to pass muster with us, they just need to put it out. Like if it had no
yeah,
games on it, I would still buy it. I'd buy it and put it on my shelf, but which is probably what I'll do anyway. Like I want to support. I want to support anything Saturn related.
yeah,
It deserves so much more love than it got. But yeah, again, it's kind of sad talking about this, but it's just realistic, folks. Like
yeah,
seriously, we're not trying to rain on folks' parade. It's just we have to kind of, and we don't have a crystal ball. We can't see the future. We just gotta go, based on what makes the most sense. And again, these companies, they exist to make money. If they're not gonna make money, then it's and they've got way too many people hired and
yeah,
too many lawyers to pay the bills for and too many healthcare plans. They have to make money. They cannot just release something because it's very rare to get something that's done just purely for fan service. Just to
yeah,
that's that rarely happens, and that only happens if a company is in such a comfortable position financially that they're able to just do stuff like that to generate
hmm
goodwill.
hmm
But again, like Sega's just not, they're not the Sega that we grew up with. It's just not.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And when you take that into consideration and you think about it in the perspective of the fact that it's Sammy Holdings, you can kind of easily piece together what you should expect. And so that's
hmm
all we'll say is that folks ought to be kind of cautiously optimistic and temper their expectations. I think that there's a better chance of us getting a Dreamcast Mini and them just skipping over the Saturn altogether. But if it does happen, like I said, if it happens in Japan, then there is at least some chance of it coming to the West. And even if it doesn't, I'll be pre-ordering that day one.
Oh yeah, of course. Same here. Yeah. So if it happens, it happens. Um, so long as they don't make a mess of what there is in there, like Sony did with the PlayStation Mini, then I think we could be happy with that. So,
Right.
and that's maybe a nice way to sort of end the discussion, is that we don't necessarily see it as a strong possibility of happening in North America, but if it does, then hopefully just Sega will make the best of what they can work with, and that it'll put out a mini console that is worthy of the Saturn name anyways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's possible too that those retrobit analog controllers, while not 100% perfect, not a perfect clone of the 3D control pad. Kind of hard to do because those Hall sensors are just perfect, but they are serviceable. And I played nights with them. It was quite fun. It was an enjoyable experience, albeit just a tad bit more casual than my normal score attack mode. And I could see those pairing or being used easily, syncing up with and being used easily on something like a Saturn mini console to play nights with analog. So how that analog is being achieved is still a mystery to me. I haven't heard back from them, and I'm not sure how exactly they're implementing the Saturn analog input. But from what I've seen and played with my own hands, it's sensitive enough to be able to move around with some finesse, and be able to really do platforming like in Cube Cat or flying in nights. It feels good. And that's what I'll say. It feels better than decent. It's good.
hmm
It's
hmm
just like I say. I'm one of those folks that's just it's really hard for anything to even come close to the 3D control pad in my book. It just is.
Yep, and that's fair.
Yeah. But I mean, I think that's really all we have that's meaningful to say about the Saturn Mini topic. It's an interesting topic, and it's not like something that we would completely avoid talking about it. I mean, I think it's worth talking about, but again, it's a lot of speculation at this point, and we have to ground it in reality. Any kind of speculation that we're going to be doing is going to be grounded in the reality of what they have to deal with from a legal standpoint. And so, yeah, I think that we can probably say maybe 50%. There's like a 50% chance. Do you think it's even that good?
Yeah, but you know what? We'll take it,
Yeah.
So.
And that's the other thing too, is like, I hope this mini console craze lasts long enough, because it does seem kind of like a fly by night kind of thing, like it's a trend that might peter off. You just never know. So, I mean, if it lasts long enough for them to, in Japan, say, okay, let's release this thing, while people still care about these, or while the market indicates that people are still pouring their money into those things, let's do it now, rather than wait. So if they do, then yeah, I think that there's I know for a fact that there will be probably a lot of hardcore Saturn fans in the US that'll just be importing the Japanese version.
As they should,
because none of us are strangers to playing the Japanese library for all these years. So, yeah,
nice.
I think that's all we have to say on that topic. And until next time, this has been Saturn Dave and Peter reminding you guys that you must play your Sega Saturn and
play Christmas Nights, because it's that time of year.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, play some Christmas Nights, open some presents, and look at some really funky old pictures of Saturn swag that I wish I had. As cringy as a lot of it is, I'm kind of jealous.
All right.
Anyway, yep. Okay, we'll catch you next time. See you guys.